Here is the image most people carry in their heads. A Marine crouches in chest-deep jungle undergrowth somewhere in the Solomon Islands, a pump-action shotgun cradled against his shoulder. A Japanese soldier bursts from the tree line at close range, bayonet fixed, screaming. The Marine racks the slide once, fires, and the man simply disappears in a spray of buckshot. It is one of the most durable visual cliches of the entire Pacific War, repeated in films, in documentaries, in 100 popular histories, presented as the specific American answer to Japan's doctrine of close-quarters night infiltration. Almost none of it survives contact with the actual documentary record. This is not a story about a weapon that failed. The Winchester Model 1897 and Model 1912 pump-action shotguns issued to United States Marine units across the Pacific were, by every available engineering measure, exactly as devastating at close range as popular memory insists. This is a story about something considerably more interesting than a failed weapon. A weapon that worked exactly as designed and still, by the verifiable historical record, barely mattered. Undone not by the enemy it was built to fight, but by a specific, mundane, entirely fixable engineering problem that the United States military did not correctly solve until the closing weeks of a war that had, by then, already been decided by other means entirely. Consider what should, by rights, have made this one of the great weapon success stories of the entire war. Japan's own combat doctrine was built almost entirely around forcing exactly the kind of close-range, low-visibility encounter a shotgun was engineered to dominate. American planners understood this. American training manuals said so explicitly. And yet, ask any serious military historian to name the weapons that actually decided the Pacific War, and the shotgun rarely makes the list at all. Crowded out by the flamethrower, the Browning automatic rifle, naval gunfire, and the sheer weight of American industrial production. The gap between what the weapon was supposed to do and what the surviving paperwork says it actually did is the entire subject of this account. To understand why the shotgun's outsized reputation and its actual documented combat footprint diverged this sharply, you have to start with the specific Japanese assumption the weapon was theoretically built to shatter, and then follow, campaign by campaign, exactly what happened when American planners' confident theory collided with the humid reality of a Pacific jungle. Imperial Japanese military doctrine, going into 1942, rested on a specific, deliberately chosen philosophy, seishin, spiritual power, understood explicitly as the quality that would allow Japanese infantry to overcome an enemy's material advantage through superior close combat training, discipline, and will. This was never simply propaganda dressed up as strategy. It reflected a genuinely calculated response to an industrial reality Japanese planners understood with uncomfortable clarity. Japan produced less steel in an entire year than the United States produced in a single month, and no amount of institutional confidence could fully paper over that specific gap. The Imperial Army's practical answer was to make the individual soldier decisive at the one range where raw material advantage mattered least: point blank, in the dark, with cold steel. The resulting tactical doctrine was consistent across theater after theater. Approach under cover of night. Infiltrate the enemy's forward positions before he could organize a coordinated response. Close to bayonet range, where months of dedicated close combat training would settle the engagement in Japan's favor, regardless of whatever rifles or machine guns the defender happened to be carrying. This approach had already produced real results against Chinese forces on the mainland, against British defenders in Malaya, against American forces defending the Philippines in the war's opening months. Japanese planners had every documented reason, walking into the Pacific Campaign, to expect the same doctrine to keep working. Imperial Japanese training manuals of this period addressed British rifles in detail. They addressed American machine guns, French mortars, Soviet submachine guns, the full conventional catalog of weapons a modern industrial army might field. They contained no meaningful discussion of shotguns whatsoever, because Japanese military planners categorized the shotgun as a tool for hunting birds rather than a weapon of war, and dismissed it from serious tactical consideration on essentially that basis alone. On paper, this reads as a genuine doctrinal blind spot, a weapon theoretically perfect for defeating exactly the close-range infiltration tactics Japan had built its entire Pacific strategy around, sitting entirely outside the enemy's threat model. It is the specific kind of gap that ought to have mattered enormously, the exact category of oversight military historians love to identify in hindsight as the hinge on which an entire campaign turned. The United States brought a real quantity of these weapons into the Pacific theater to exploit precisely that gap. Winchester manufactured roughly 25,000 Model 1897 shotguns, and somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 Model 1912s for military contracts across the war, with Remington, Stevens, and Ithaca contributing additional thousands under their own designations. The Model 1897, designed by John Browning and refined across more than 4 decades of continuous production, became the primary Marine combat shotgun in the war's early Pacific campaigns. Fitted for military service with a 20-inch barrel, a perforated heat shield around the barrel, and a bayonet lug compatible with the standard M1917 sword bayonet. Critically, the Model 1897 lacked any trigger disconnector at all, which meant a shooter holding the trigger down while working the pump could fire continuously with each cycle of the action, a technique Marines called slam fire, capable of putting 6 loads of buckshot downrange in roughly 2 seconds. The Model 1912, engineered by Winchester's T.C. Johnson as a refinement of Browning's original concept, added an internal hammer mechanism specifically to prevent the kind of accidental discharge the 1897's design permitted, and had largely replaced the older model in frontline Marine service by 1943, though both weapons continued serving in parallel through the war's final year. The ammunition itself was engineered for exactly the environment Marines expected to fight in. Standard 00 buckshot loads carried 9 individual pellets, each roughly 8.4 millimeters in diameter, spreading to a pattern of approximately 10 inches at 10 yards, 20 inches at 20 yards, 30 inches at 30 yards, a spread pattern specifically forgiving of imprecise aim in the dense, close-range vegetation where Pacific combat so often actually happened, where visibility routinely fell well under 30 yards and a fraction of a second's hesitation with a bolt-action rifle could be fatal. A single blast at genuine close range functioned, in practical terms, less like a rifle shot and more like a small, hand-aimed area weapon, precisely the tool a doctrine built around night ambush and sudden close contact would seem to demand. Every element of this weapon system, considered purely on its own engineering merits, should have made it devastating precisely where Japan's own doctrine expected to win. The August 1942 battle, popularly remembered as the Tenaru River fight, though the actual engagement was fought along Alligator Creek, the river itself sitting some distance away, a geographic mislabeling that stuck in American memory regardless, offers the clearest illustration of how the shotgun's actual combat role diverges from its later mythology. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki commanded a detachment that had, by several surviving accounts, badly underestimated the American defensive position facing it, expecting a comparatively lightly held beachhead, rather than the entrenched Marine line his men actually encountered. His 917-man force attacked directly in the kind of concentrated night assault Japanese doctrine had built its entire theory of victory around, and was virtually annihilated. 789 Japanese dead against a defending force that held its ground. Popular Pacific War narratives frequently cite this engagement as an early demonstration of shotgun effectiveness against the Japanese banzai charge. The primary sources tell a different, more specific story. American after-action accounts attribute the overwhelming majority of Japanese casualties to water-cooled M1917 Browning machine guns and 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister rounds, improvised close-range anti-personnel loads that functioned, in practical effect, as a considerably larger-scale version of exactly the shotgun principle, dispersed steel fragments covering a wide killing zone. Shotguns receive, at most, passing mention in the same accounts. The weapon that actually broke Ichiki's detachment was crew-served and mounted, not a Marine with a Winchester working a pump action. Throughout the broader Guadalcanal campaign that followed, Marines did employ shotguns, primarily for perimeter security and jungle patrol work, with photographic evidence from the period showing point men carrying Winchester shotguns on patrol, positioned specifically to respond to close-range ambush in terrain where a rifle's longer effective range offered little practical advantage. But the campaign's own after-action reports focus overwhelmingly on machine guns, rifles, and artillery as the weapons actually determining engagement outcomes. and the specific reason for that imbalance surfaced almost immediately. The jungle itself was quietly disabling the shotgun before it ever reached the fight. The standard American combat shotgun shell of 1942 used a paper hull, cheap, reliable in temperate conditions, entirely unsuited to the environment the Marine Corps was about to deploy it into. Pacific Island humidity routinely approached 100%. Paper hulls absorbed that moisture directly and swelled, sometimes to the point that a shell chambering easily in dry storage conditions became physically impossible to load in the field. Marines on Guadalcanal reported having to hammer swollen shells into chambers by hand, an obviously unworkable solution in the middle of active combat, and one that meant a shotgun carried into the field could, with real frequency, simply fail to function as a weapon at all by the time it was actually needed. Picture the specific moment this failure mode actually mattered. A Marine on night perimeter duty hears movement in the tree line, reaches for his weapon, racks the pump, and the shell does not seat. There is no second attempt available in that specific window. The weapon that was supposed to be the fastest, most forgiving close-range tool in the entire Marine arsenal had, by that point, quietly become one of the least reliable. This was not a minor operational inconvenience quietly absorbed and worked around. It was a systemic failure that persisted, essentially unresolved, for the better part of 3 years. The fix existed in principle from early in the war: a brass-cased shell, moisture-resistant by simple virtue of its material, eliminating the swelling problem at the root rather than managing around it. Ordnance officers in the field understood the problem clearly enough. Several unit-level reports from as early as 1943 specifically flagged paper hull degradation as a recurring maintenance and reliability issue, language that reads, in retrospect, like a documented request for exactly the fix that would not actually arrive for another 2 years. The United States military did not formally adopt the all-brass M19 shell, officially designated shot shell, shotgun, brass, 12-gauge, number 00 buck, M19, until March 29, 1945, less than 5 months before the war's end. For nearly the entire Pacific Campaign, American forces were fighting with a weapon system whose ammunition had a documented, well-understood failure mode that nobody with the authority to fix it treated as urgent enough to fix quickly. This single fact does more to explain the shotgun's muted combat record than any tactical or doctrinal factor that followed it. The Marine Corps had, in fairness, built a genuinely serious training program around the weapon well before the ammunition problem became fully apparent. Technical Manual TM9-285, published September 21, 1942, formally covered the Winchester Model 97 and Model 12 alongside the Remington Model 11, the Stevens Models 520 and 620, and the Ithaca Model 37, a full catalog of the shotgun types then entering military service. Training took place at Marine installations, including Camp Pendleton in California, Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, and Parris Island in South Carolina, with instructions specifically covering point security on patrol, rapid engagement during night defense, cave and bunker clearing procedures, and prisoner guard duties. Marines learned the Model 97 slam fire technique in this program, though instructors specifically warned trainees against over-reliance on it, citing both ammunition consumption and the barrel heating that rapid continuous fire produced. Under the Marine Corps Table of Organization effective in 1943, each Marine division was formally authorized 306 shotguns, distributed primarily to military police companies, pioneer battalions, and selected rifle squads assigned specialized duties. This allocation meant shotguns were genuinely present in essentially every major Marine operation of the war. It also meant they represented less than 2% of a division's total small arms inventory, present in numbers meaningfully closer to a specialist tool than a standard-issue combat weapon. The New Guinea campaign, running from 1942 through 1945 across some of the most punishing terrain of the entire war, offered a direct field test of whether the shotgun could actually deliver on its theoretical promise once Army units, rather than Marines, requested the weapon based specifically on reported Marine experience at Guadalcanal. The U.S. Army's 32nd and 41st Infantry Divisions both put in formal requests. New Guinea's jungle, with visibility in the dense highland growth sometimes measured in single-digit yards, presented conditions that should, in theory, have been close to ideal for a spreading buckshot pattern, arguably a more extreme test environment than Guadalcanal itself, given New Guinea's combination of higher average rainfall, denser canopy cover, and terrain that frequently required units to cross the same swollen river multiple times in a single day of movement. The same paper shell moisture problem that had already compromised the weapon at Guadalcanal proved, if anything, considerably worse in New Guinea's specific combination of constant rain, repeated river crossings, and extreme sustained humidity. Units that had specifically requested shotguns based on second-hand reports from the Pacific's earlier campaigns frequently left them behind in rear area storage once the ammunition's actual field reliability became apparent, falling back instead on M1 Garands, Thompson submachine guns, and Browning automatic rifles, weapons whose ammunition carried no equivalent moisture vulnerability. The New Guinea experience demonstrated, in the bluntest possible terms, the specific gap between a weapon's theoretical combat value and its actual field reliability. Excellent in a training exercise on a dry range at Paris Island, compromised the moment it entered the one environment it had actually been requested for. By the time the war reached its final, largest island campaigns, the shotgun's specific tactical niche had narrowed considerably from what planners had originally envisioned. Marine doctrine by mid-war had settled on three specific applications where the weapons still made genuine sense. Point security on patrol, where a scout carrying a shotgun could respond to sudden close-range ambush with immediate, overwhelming fire. Perimeter defense against night infiltration, where the weapon's spread pattern compensated for the near-total darkness in which Japanese infiltration attempts typically occurred. And prisoner guard duties, where its psychological deterrent value and the simple, deliberately audible sound of a pump action being racked served a genuine security function without necessarily requiring the weapon to be fired at all. The October 1944 return to the Philippines produced a substantial Sixth Army request for shotgun allocations, specifically intended for the anticipated urban combat inside Manila. A request grounded in the reasonable theoretical assumption that close-quarters building clearance represented exactly the range band a shotgun was built for. Marine ground participation in the broader Philippines campaign, though, remained limited primarily to artillery support and air operations. The actual house-to-house fighting inside Manila fell mainly to the Army's 37th Infantry Division, whose own after-action reports emphasize other weapons entirely as the ones that actually reduced Japanese strongpoints, with shotguns receiving comparatively little mention despite their presence in the fighting. Japanese defenders in Manila, moreover, adapted quickly to the specific threat a shotgun posed at close range, barricading positions in ways that prevented American forces from closing to effective shotgun distance in the first place, converting what should have been the weapon's ideal tactical environment into precisely the kind of extended-range engagement where a shotgun's advantages evaporated entirely. Iwo Jima, invaded in February 1945, saw 3 Marine divisions carry a combined authorized allocation of 918 shotguns onto an island whose volcanic ash, extensive tunnel networks, and heavily fortified bunker systems created combat conditions that left the weapon almost entirely irrelevant to the actual fighting. General Kurabayashi's defensive plan for the island had abandoned beach defense almost entirely in favor of a deep network of fortified positions connected by miles of tunnels, engineered specifically to draw American forces into prolonged reduction fighting against fixed positions, rather than the kind of open, close-quarters encounter a shotgun could exploit. The iconic flag raising atop Mount Suribachi occurred only after specialized flamethrower and demolition teams had physically cleared the Japanese positions dominating the peak, not after any shotgun assault. Marine units across the island relied overwhelmingly on the M2-2 flamethrower for cave clearing, a weapon capable of projecting burning fuel some 40 yards directly into a cave mouth, a range no shotgun could begin to approach. Specialized flame tanks provided additional support beyond what infantry-carried flamethrowers alone could deliver, and Marines expended an estimated 27,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel across the battle, a figure meticulously documented in after-action logistics reports in a way no equivalent shotgun ammunition expenditure record survives to match. Of the roughly 26,000 American casualties sustained across the battle, no surviving record attributes any specific loss to shotgun unavailability or to any documented tactical failure connected to the weapon. The M19 brass ammunition, still months from wide distribution, never reached the island in time to matter.
Okinawa, fought from April through June 1945, arrived with the ammunition problem finally solved. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions carried a combined 612 authorized shotguns, now supplied with reliable brass-case shells for the first time in the entire Pacific campaign. By this point, though, Japan's own defensive doctrine had evolved specifically away from the close-range night infiltration tactics that had originally made the shotgun theoretically valuable. General Ushijima's 32nd Army, defending Okinawa, had deliberately abandoned the banzai charge as a primary tactic in favor of a defense-in-depth strategy built around the fortified Shuri line, bunkers and interconnected cave systems specifically designed to keep American infantry engaged at extended range rather than drawn into the close-quarters encounters where a shotgun's advantages would have mattered. The specific irony here is difficult to overstate. The one Pacific campaign where the shotgun finally had reliable ammunition was also the one campaign where Japan had specifically restructured its own doctrine to deny the weapon the exact conditions it needed to matter. Marine units at Okinawa relied primarily on coordinated tank infantry tactics, with armored support providing the close-range firepower that infantry-carried shotguns had originally been expected to deliver. Where shotguns did see genuine use came mainly in the final stages of clearing already captured fortifications of surviving Japanese defenders, and in military police duties managing the enormous civilian population displaced by the fighting. Real applications, but a narrow fraction of the overall combat effort across a battle that ran nearly 3 months. Perhaps the single most persuasive evidence for the shotgun's genuinely marginal combat role is not what the historical record contains, but what it conspicuously does not. Eugene Sledge's memoir, With the Old Breed, widely regarded as one of the finest personal narratives to emerge from the entire Pacific War, covers his service in a rifle company at both Peleliu and Okinawa in exhaustive, often unbearably vivid detail. The specific weight of a mortar round, the exact sound of a Nambu machine gun, the particular horror of Peleliu's coral ridges, and never once mentions shotguns. Robert Leckie's Helmet for My Pillow, an equally celebrated account of his own service with the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal, contains the identical omission, despite Leckie's own service in a unit that would, by table of organization, have had shotguns present somewhere in its ranks. The Library of Congress Veterans History Project holds thousands of recorded Pacific War interviews. Detailed shotgun combat accounts within that entire collection are scarce to the point of near absence. The National Museum of the Pacific War's archive of more than 4,000 oral histories tells the same story. Veterans who fought through years of jungle and island combat, recalling specific rifle rounds fired, specific grenades thrown, specific mortar barrages endured, simply do not produce comparable specific shotgun accounts in any meaningful volume, a silence considerably harder to explain away than a simple gap in the surviving paperwork, particularly given how comprehensively these same veterans documented every other weapon they carried or encountered. The few veteran accounts that do address the weapon directly tend to confirm exactly this marginal situational role rather than contradict it. One Marine veteran interviewed decades after the war, recalling his service on Guadalcanal, described the Model 97 as good for night watch and jungle paths, but added that it could not engage at range, and that once serious shooting actually started, what he wanted in his hands was a rifle. A separate veteran of the 2nd Marine Division described his own squad's shotgun allocation in blunter terms still. Each squad was technically supposed to have one, but it spent roughly half its time sitting with the company's general equipment, treated as too specialized for everyday carry. Neither account describes a weapon that failed outright. Both describe a weapon that Marines themselves, on the actual ground, judged too narrow in its usefulness to carry as a primary arm. The administrative paper trail behind the fighting corroborates the veteran's own memory with unusual precision. Rifle and machine gun replacement parts requisitions appear constantly throughout Marine Division supply records, direct evidence of heavy, sustained combat wear. Comparable shotgun parts requests are notably rare across the same records, and armorer reports from multiple Marine divisions describe shotguns requiring maintenance primarily to address storage corrosion, rather than any wear pattern consistent with actual firing. The specific signature, in other words, of a weapon that spent most of its service life sitting in an arms room rather than cycling through a pump action in the field. Ammunition requisition records complete the picture. Divisions requested millions of rifle rounds and hundreds of thousands of machine gun rounds to sustain individual operations, while shotgun shell requests remained comparatively modest throughout, frequently tied more directly to ongoing training requirements than to actual combat consumption. Even the Operational Research Section, the U.S. military's own wartime analytical body, which produced detailed quantitative studies of artillery, mortar, and small arms effectiveness throughout the war, complete with hit probabilities and casualty correlations for essentially every other weapon system in the American arsenal, left behind no comparable statistical study of shotgun combat performance. The specific absence of that data point is itself a data point. A weapon genuinely reshaping battle outcomes at the scale popular memory assigns it would very likely have generated exactly the kind of dedicated analytical attention every other significant weapon system received as a matter of course. Simple logistics compounded the weapon's narrow role further still. A single 12-gauge shotgun shell weighed roughly twice as much as a standard rifle cartridge, while occupying about 3 times the physical volume. A Marine could carry roughly 80 rounds of rifle ammunition in the same weight and space that 36 shotgun shells required. On landing craft and supply ships with strictly finite cargo capacity, this made shotgun ammunition a comparatively low logistical priority against rifle rounds, machine gun belts, and mortar shells competing for the identical limited space. And it meant that even Marines who did carry a shotgun into combat frequently did so with only 1 or 2 boxes of shells expected to last an entire operation, a scarcity that actively discouraged liberal use even in situations where the weapon might genuinely have helped. The Japanese side of this specific story is in its own way equally revealing. Not for what Japanese forces did in response to the American shotgun, but for the near-total institutional silence surrounding it. When German forces first encountered American shotguns in the trenches of the First World War, the German government filed a formal diplomatic protest in September 1918, explicitly asserting the weapon violated the Hague Convention's prohibitions against causing unnecessary suffering, and reportedly threatened to summarily execute any captured American soldier found carrying one. The German objection, whatever its legal merits, at least demonstrates that one wartime enemy had judged the weapon significant enough to escalate through formal diplomatic channels. Imperial Japan, confronting the identical weapon a generation later under considerably more extended combat exposure, years rather than months, across a dozen major campaigns rather than a handful of trench encounters, filed no comparable protest at any point in the Pacific War. Surviving Japanese military documents captured during and after the conflict contain no specific tactical countermeasures directed at shotguns whatsoever. Japanese training materials addressed countering American firepower broadly. Machine guns, artillery, flamethrowers all receive explicit, detailed tactical attention, but never single out the shotgun as a threat requiring its own dedicated response. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers, extensively documented across multiple archives, discuss American material superiority, overwhelming combined arms firepower, and specific effective tactics at real length. Shotguns essentially do not appear in these assessments at all, a silence that stands in sharp, specific contrast to the extensive Japanese tactical adaptation documented in direct response to American flamethrowers, a weapon Japanese forces clearly recognized as requiring a dedicated countermeasure and worked seriously to develop one against. This silence extended into Japan's broader defensive evolution across the war. The specific tactical adaptations Japan did make in response to American firepower, overhead cover engineered specifically against mortar fire, dispersed spider hole positions built to survive American armor, reverse slope defensive lines designed to reduce exposure to naval gunfire, targeted exactly the weapons genuinely determining Pacific battle outcomes. The absence of any equivalent shotgun-specific countermeasure, considered against Japan's demonstrated willingness and real institutional capacity to adapt seriously when a weapon actually threatened battlefield outcomes, suggests strongly that the shotgun simply never crossed the threshold of tactical significance that would have made a countermeasure worth Japanese planners' limited attention. This is worth stating plainly, because it inverts the popular version of the story almost entirely. Japan's failure to prepare for American shotguns was not a costly strategic blind spot exploited to devastating effect. It was, in retrospect, a reasonably accurate, if entirely unintentional, assessment of a threat that never actually materialized at the scale anyone on either side originally expected. A useful comparative check comes from looking at how other Allied and Axis forces handled the identical tactical problem the shotgun was meant to solve. British and Australian forces fighting through comparable Pacific and Southeast Asian jungle terrain fielded only minimal numbers of combat shotguns, relying instead on standard rifles and submachine guns for close-range jungle engagements, without any correspondingly worse combat outcome that can be specifically traced to that equipment choice. Soviet forces, fighting across an extraordinary range of terrain from dense urban combat at Stalingrad to open rural fighting around Kursk, never adopted the shotgun as a standard combat weapon, despite genuinely massive parallel small arms production capacity, and despite facing, in Stalingrad's ruined apartment blocks and cellars, close quarters combat conditions arguably more extreme than anything the Pacific jungle produced. Chinese forces engaged in sustained, desperate close-quarters fighting against Japan for years before American entry into the war, likewise never incorporated shotguns into their own arsenal, despite an obvious urgent tactical need for effective close-range weapons of any kind, and despite considerably less institutional resistance to unconventional weapon adoption than either the American or Japanese militaries displayed. Multiple nations, facing broadly comparable tactical problems across very different theaters, independently arrived at combat outcomes without ever making the specific weapon choice the United States made, a pattern that argues the shotgun represented one tactical option among several, rather than any genuinely indispensable capability unique to Pacific combat. The shotgun's post-war military career traces the identical marginal pattern established during World War II itself. Post-war infantry board studies, tasked with determining which wartime weapons merited continued institutional investment and development, prioritized rifles, machine guns, mortars, and the emerging category of recoilless rifles. Shotguns received comparatively little dedicated attention, a reasonably direct institutional signal about how the weapon's actual wartime performance had been assessed by the officers who had just finished fighting with it. Winchester itself, for its part, returned the Model 12's production lines almost entirely to civilian sporting models within a year of the war's end, a commercial decision that tracked the same institutional verdict from the manufacturer's own side of the ledger. Korea, despite extensive close-quarters combat across genuinely difficult terrain, saw limited shotgun deployment. Marine veterans of the Pacific Campaign, now leading patrols in Korea, generally carried M1 Garands, Browning automatic rifles, and carbines rather than shotguns. A practical equipment choice made by men who had personally lived through the weapon's actual Pacific track record rather than its subsequent popular mythology, and whose battlefield judgment on this specific point deserves considerably more institutional weight than it has generally received in the decades since. Vietnam saw a genuine, if narrower, revival of shotgun use, particularly modified commercial models issued to point men and to the specialized tunnel rats operating inside Viet Cong tunnel complexes. An environment that, unlike most of the Pacific, actually delivered the consistently close, confined engagement ranges the weapon had originally been built around. But even there, the weapon remained a specialist tool assigned to particular men in particular roles, never approaching standard general-issue armament. The pattern holds essentially unchanged into the present day, with shotguns retained by modern military forces specifically for door breaching, less lethal ammunition delivery, and narrowly defined close-quarter scenarios, a contemporary role that, examined honestly, tracks the weapon's actual World War II employment considerably more accurately than the popular mythology built up around it since. The mythology's staying power owes more to narrative appeal than to deception. A hunting weapon repurposed for war, devastating at exactly the range Japan's own doctrine claimed as its strength, that image is cheap to stage on film, visually unambiguous, and needs no explanation of ammunition logistics to land with an audience. Popular culture absorbed and amplified it across decades, each retelling further detached from the record this account has traced. Here is the forensic verdict this account arrives at. The Winchester shotgun was never a failed weapon. Every individual piece of engineering behind it performed close to exactly as its designers intended, devastating within its specific, narrow, effective range, genuinely well-suited to the close-quarters jungle combat Pacific planners expected to face in quantity. Its actual documented battlefield significance nonetheless remained consistently narrow throughout nearly the entire war, for reasons that had comparatively little to do with the enemy it was originally built to defeat. A specific, well-understood ammunition defect,
paper hulls absorbing tropical humidity and swelling until they simply would not chamber, went essentially unaddressed for nearly 3 years of active combat. And the fix that finally arrived in March 1945 came too late to meaningfully affect the outcome of any of the Pacific War's largest remaining battles. Simple logistics worked steadily against the weapon throughout. Heavier ammunition, bulkier ammunition, a narrower effective range than a standard-issue rifle, competing for genuinely finite cargo space against ammunition types the same landing craft needed in vastly greater bulk. And Japan, for its part, never developed a dedicated countermeasure against the shotgun for the simplest possible reason available. It never needed to, because the weapon never inflicted the kind of sustained, battle-deciding damage that would have forced Japanese planners' hand the way American flamethrowers, artillery, and naval gunfire clearly did.
The United States possessed, by any reasonable measure, the industrial capacity to arm every single Marine rifle squad with a shotgun, rather than the roughly 300 allotted per division. Winchester's own production numbers confirm the manufacturing capability existed several times over. That capacity was never the limiting factor. What limited the weapon was everything downstream of manufacturing: a supply chain, a logistics system, and the Japanese enemy whose own evolving doctrine moved steadily away from the exact conditions the weapon needed. The specific gap between the shotgun's genuine engineering promise and its comparatively modest documented combat record illustrates something considerably broader than the fate of one particular weapon. Technical capability alone does not automatically produce tactical impact. A weapon has to survive actual field conditions, integrate cleanly into a functioning logistics chain, and earn a genuine place inside operational doctrine before its theoretical advantages translate into anything measurable on a real battlefield. And the shotgun, for most of its own war, satisfied none of those three conditions simultaneously. Japan's specific doctrinal blind spot regarding shotguns turned out to be strategically irrelevant precisely because the weapon itself never became significant enough, in practice, for that blind spot to matter. The war in the Pacific was decided by industrial production at overwhelming scale, by coordinated combined arms tactics, by naval gunfire and carrier aviation, and the flamethrowers' brutal effectiveness against fortified cave positions, not, whatever popular memory now insists, by the occasional close-range blast of buckshot in the undergrowth. The Marine with the trench gun remains one of the most durable and visually compelling images to survive the entire Pacific War. The verified historical record underneath that image tells a considerably more mundane and considerably more instructive story about exactly how far a genuinely good weapon can travel on engineering promise alone, before logistics, environment, and institutional urgency finally decide whether that promise is ever actually redeemed on the battlefield it was built for.